Shabbat Shalom. Since we began a few moments late today, I will fold my few thoughts on Judaism 101 straight into my talk for this morning. What I wanted to do is show you a few sources in the Torah on my theme for last night, for today, and perhaps even into next week, and that is the idea of chokhmah. Probably the founding idea of chokhmah in the Torah is when God chooses Bezalel to be the architect, the renderer of the Mishkan, the tabernacle that the Israelites will build, that seems to be in the mind of the divine, and someone has to be able to see what's in the mind of the divine, and then take those architectural plans, and then render them into reality. And Bezalel is said to have three qualities: Chokhmah, Tuvuna, Vida'at. Chokhmah, wisdom; Tuvuna, discernment and knowledge. So when many people start studying Chokhmah, they start to ask themselves, what are the differences between Chokhmah, wisdom, Tuvuna, discernment, and Da'at, knowledge? Well, one thing we do when we move to the actual building of the Mishkan, we say that God chooses people of Chacham Lev, of wise heart. Now, what are the people of wise heart able to do? They're able to sow, they're able to build, they're able to fabricate. So one meaning of chokhmah in the Bible, we would call something like techne, the ability to fabricate and build things. And look how different this is from the idea that at one level chokhmah is to be able to discern something like a divine plan. And another meaning of chokhmah is actually able to be the one who builds those things. So if we try to trace the word chokhmah through the Bible, what we see is it's used in many different contexts, in many different meanings. So we actually don't find a single definition of either chokhmah, wisdom, tivuna, or binah, meaning distinctions, and dot. We don't have one clear picture of them, but I'll give you a few thoughts of mine and then go back onto the theme. When we think of chokhmah in the Bible and then in rabbinic literature, a person with wisdom seems to have an overall grasp of that which is important. Part of it is understanding, for our purposes, understanding the human condition, understanding the processes that people can go through. In their own particular life, they understand themselves, they have insight into themselves, other people, what happens between people, and how to move things from a tough moment into a better moment. The word binah or tivuna is from the Hebrew word bain, lahavin, which means to understand, literally means to understand the difference between things. And an essential part of this is the difference between words and concepts. So from my perspective, when we say chokhmah, binah, vida'at, or chokhmah, tivuna, vida'at, wisdom, knowledge, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, I would translate it as wisdom, this overall sense, tivuna, discernment, knowing one thing from another, knowing the difference between things, and therefore knowing the precise definitions of words and terms. And then dot, again, has another kind of meaning entirely. Where do we see the first mention of the word dot? In the Eitz Dat Tov V'Ra, in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's actually a little more of a curse than a blessing as we look in the commentators, because the name of the tree is not knowledge between good and evil, but rather knowledge that there is good and evil. So I believe, as you know, that the story of the Garden of Eden in many ways is written in an ironic and murky style. It's not as clear as many people think it is. It's not a moral object lesson. It's more mysterious than it is clear. But if we go to other parts of the Bible, the word knowledge has a sense of a deep intuitive knowledge. So, for example, the word da'at, the verb is la da'at. A person who has knowledge is a yodea. So ani yodea, I know something. And you see in the blessings, we are called Yodei Adonai, the knowers of God. I prefer this term much more than I like the idea of someone who believes in God, because that sometimes means believes in the dogma, affirms the dogma. The Bible doesn't have that idea at all, that laha'amin means to believe dogma. The word in the Bible, laha'amin, means to have trust or faith in. So we'll go to what I think is the best way to understand a person of faith, a person of emunah, is for me not trust, because I believe in the brokenness of the divine, and I don't believe that we can in any way, I hope this doesn't alarm people, trust in hashgacha pratit and trust in divine providence. We just see the complete randomness and sometimes cruelty in history, and anybody who thinks that they have some kind of exemption from the randomness, the pain, the misfortune in history, I think we are not wise. We're fooling ourselves. There's a lot we can do to live in a prudential way to minimize whatever harm, misfortune comes upon us, but we're not immune from it because we believe in or have faith in God. So this is a piece of wisdom I've had to share many, many times over my life as a rabbi, and that is for people who say something like, why would God do this to me when they suffer misfortune? So I think it's a concept that lives within people that's just not sustainable, that their faith in the divine protects them from misfortune. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, you find that many, many times in the Bible. In fact, in the book of Job, where Job is suffering because of a wager between Satan and God, whether Job will break under misfortune, Job's friends come to Job and say, you must have done something wrong because God would never dispense misery to a just person. That's the basic position of Job's friends. Job has the wisdom to say, I didn't do anything this bad that accounts for what has happened to me. So that is not the answer. And then Job demands an audience with God because he has the wisdom and resilience not to accept what his friends are saying. So his friends are saying something that you might say most religious traditions do say until they enter into the modern metaphoric world, and that is misery is God dispensing justice. Now, we absolutely know that not to be true, but many people have to believe it because they want to believe that the world is run by justice. It is not. I think a wise person reflecting on the human condition would say we ought to be just as running our society, but being a person of justice doesn't guarantee you anything. Being a person of prudence might, but certainly not a person of justice. By the way, some people think that the idea that there is no justice in this world, at least not in a deep, thorough sense, that's one reason people created the idea of the next world, that there might not be justice in this realm, so there ought to be justice in the next realm. I don't have anything against that idea. I don't have any intimate knowledge whether that's true or not. But if someone said to me they believed that all accounts are settled in the next world, I hope that's true. I hope everybody gets what they deserve. But again, I'm not going to count on that. But I will say a person who believes that because they have faith in God, they're protected in this world, I think that is not a wise person. I understand why they say it. It's not a wise thing to say, because then you look at someone suffering and you'll say, like Job's friends, what did they do wrong? You might look at your own suffering and say, what did I do wrong? Which I think are wasted thoughts. What a wise person knows how to do is deal with adversity. A wise person knows how to go through suffering. A wise person knows how to grieve well. A wise person knows how to comfort another person who is suffering. So I think there are many more wise things to do with our thoughts, with our feelings, than believe in ideas that, from my perspective, are just not sustainable if we observe the world fairly. So going back to my theme from last night, I'll repeat just a little bit. In my own life and when I counsel other people, the origin of wisdom, the foundation of wisdom, is insight into yourself, insight to others, and into the human condition. Let me give you a few examples of this at maybe the most banal level, but at a level that causes a great deal of misery. And this is sometimes when I counsel what I'll call younger people, which means anybody 67 and below, because I'm 68, so that's my age, my term of young. But I'm thinking more of people, let's say, in their 40s and under. Here's a common thing. Somebody that used to be a student of mine, for example, would call me and say, Rabbi Finley, I hope you can do my marriage. I said, what's happening? You're getting married? He said, no, I met the right person. So already my red alarm goes off. And I say, how long have you known the person? I've known them for 2 weeks. This is the one. I just want to make sure that you're still doing weddings when the time comes. I say, may I offer you a word? Sure. I say, whatever happens in the first 6 to 8 weeks, even up to 6 months, don't trust it. There's something in the human condition, in the process of things, that has us not only based on arousal and attraction, but also a deep, almost a chemistry sense, that you found the person who fulfills you as a human being. It's an overwhelming feeling that people who fall into love feel. Now, when I say fall into love, it really is like falling. People don't choose their way into love. They don't rationally deliberate. They fall into it. Now, a person who understands the process of human beings, for example, the process of people falling in love, who understands themselves and can go into a higher observer mind and say, here's what's happening to me. My inner life, my soul, finally feels that it has met the person who will know my soul, understand me, care for me, comfort me, and all these incredible things that are at the core of human longing. The other person is feeling the same thing. Now, oftentimes that comes with a great sexual attraction, and there's something in the unconscious ego self that says, you have to trust this. Now, those of us who have been through enough life, we know that the shine wears off. In the initial brilliant shine wears off in anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. We all know that. And a courtship phase does continue. So if there are struggles, if there are fights, if there are disagreements, they're put into the context of the great love. And typically, from my experience, counseling so many people, including couples getting married, within the first 6 to 18 months, 6 months probably minimum maybe, but sometimes earlier, it doesn't last longer than 18 months where you realize you're dealing with a flawed human being, that you are a flawed human being, the stars are not lined up, and you're in for a lot of work. Now, oftentimes for many people, there's a kind of a depression that kicks in because the initial hope didn't survive, the initial hope that this is going to be easy. Now, if anybody has had an easy romantic relationship or an easy friendship from beginning till now, I'm really happy for you. Most relationships at some point, okay, so David and Diana, good for you, okay? Most relationships at some point do go, what I'll say, valleys and heights and valleys and heights, and the wise person knows how to negotiate that. Now, even more deeply, I try to think from an evolutionary perspective why it is in the human condition that most romances begin on fire and then calm down to an ember and sometimes go on fire again, back down to an ember. Why is that the case? I'll give you my theory. Now, I might be right, I might be wrong, but whenever I look at a lot of evidence, as I mentioned last night, when I look at a lot of evidence, I try to build a theory on the evidence. And one thing I believe is that many processes in the human condition, including different human personalities, are rooted in evolutionary psychology. So why would evolutionary psychology prefer falling deeply and madly in love? Because I'm going to guess in the old days, when people fell deeply and madly in love and were overwhelmed with the desire to have sex with the other person, they got married, right? The family around them, the village, the families, etc., would say, if you're feeling this way, you want to have sex with each other, you've got to get married. So they're married before the shine wears off. While they're in the throes of love, they get married. So when they realize there might be trouble, they're already married, there might be a child on the way, but in those cases, remember, they have an entire tribal culture that is supporting them. So one of the advantages of at least in the old days, of marrying in the throes of romance is the procreation, the marriage starts, but the insurance is the wisdom of the elders, the wisdom of the families, helping people go through things. Another part of the wisdom of the elders, the wisdom of the village, is that they know the human condition. They know other people. They know the families of other people. They know the parents and grandparents of other people, the aunts and uncles of people. And even without, in an informal way, they can understand what we would say, the personality genetic inheritance of a given person. So the passion of falling in love, in my mind, was wise from an evolutionary perspective, in the sense that it helped the human condition move forward, the human race move forward. But it was an evolutionary quote unquote wisdom that's found in many more great layers of wisdom. So another thing that I've concluded as I try to work with people is that we are not prepared for isolated lives in single-family dwellings where we are supposed to be able to work things out all on our own. Meaning two people without the advantage of a large family. Sometimes the parents aren't that wise, but the grandparents might be. Sometimes the father might not be wise, but his brothers and sisters are. The mother might not be wise, but her family is. There's enough collected wisdom in the village that when a couple is going through something, the wisdom contains them. The problem in the isolated life, what I call the two people moving in with each other in what I'll call the box, there simply isn't enough accumulated wisdom in that person's life or the other person's life to help them go through tough moments with wisdom. So another definition of wisdom for me is wisdom stored up in culture, wisdom stored up in traditions. And this is one reason why when I look at my own understanding of the world, why I go from liberal to conservative. The liberal idea is aiming toward more fairness and the idea that laws create a better society. I believe that to be true. But as I began to understand conservatism better, conservatives understand the stored up wisdom in a society that is oftentimes needed to push society forward. So one of the conservative critiques of liberals is you're moving too fast. It's a good law, but you don't have the wisdom stored up to know the laws of unforeseen consequences. The critique of the liberal to the conservatives, you're moving too slowly. So I see myself as someone who has the idea that there might be a good law to fix society. We might not have the wisdom to live up to it. So for me, there's a question between, you might say, the wisdom of a good law and the wisdom of what it means for a society, a culture, to know how to implement. It's just one example, what I call the wisdom to understand both. So I work toward this wisdom. I try not to be on one side or the other. I try to understand things both from the sense of stored up wisdom in culture. So you don't want to move things too fast because it might be a while before culture and society catch up. And of course, the wisdom to know when we have to move society forward. So going back to the theme of the couple in love where things don't last, another thing that I tell people is when things get hard, don't make decisions hastily because you're miserable. This actually might be the right person. You might just not have the wisdom to move through it. So now I'll go to another wisdom that I share in my wisdom works. And again, I'm sharing wisdom at the very basic level of human relationships. And I'll repeat some of it that you already know. The first wisdom is virtue. And as I wrote in my Shabbat thought, the wisdom not to say or do destructive things. Now, one would think people would know that. One would think that people know not to criticize, complain, condemn, and use hard language. You would think that people would know not to engage in defensiveness for very long, to settle down, move on to the next thing. You would think that people would know not to try to change another person, thinking that our definition of what they should be good enough for both of us. So since I know what you should become, I will persuade you to become that, And what I've learned is something I share in my classes, which is never try to persuade a resistant person to do, not do, understand, realize, or be aware of anything. Take no for an answer. And whatever you're going to do next, make sure it's wise. You don't sulk. You don't become passive aggressive. You sit and ask yourself, what do I do now when in my mind, I've come up with the wise thing to do? My partner, the person in my family, can't see it. What do I do now? And here's something sad for me to report. You might say this basic wisdom that you can't change other people based on instinct. You can't change other people based on being right. When people say, for example, I want to teach my child responsibility, I sometimes say, show me your lesson plan. Well, they don't have a lesson plan. All they have is, instead of teach, they instruct, they command. My response is, that's not called teaching, that's called ordering. It's the same thing in many other relationships. Somebody's doing something wrong. They're not as enlightened as we are, or maybe we're not as enlightened as we think. But the conclusion of the unconscious ego self is simply to tell other people what to do. I think that is more satisfactory to us because we feel we have to do something, which I think leads to a greater relief with them than the necessity to think in a wise way. So wisdom takes work and takes time. The unconscious ego self is satisfied with being right and therefore telling people what to do. The wise person understands that either I'm wrong, it's a hard thing to imagine that you're wrong either in your thought or in the way that you want to communicate it, or maybe the other person is wrong-headed right now. But you don't communicate wisdom from ordering, you communicate wisdom from teaching, and teaching something like character, good decision-making, reasoning, and values is much more complicated than anybody can think. The reason I'm focusing on this is that if I were to summarize my years of teaching and counseling, it comes down to these ideas of wisdom, knowing oneself, knowing other people, knowing life processes in a very large way. What does it mean to fall in love? What does it mean to separate? I mean, the wisdom of people separating with some degree of dignity and not trying to destroy each other in the process, which I oftentimes see. The wisdom of, if you have children, of what it means to bring children into the world and to raise children. I meet many, many unwise parents. What it means to be a child. Sometimes children are driven by urges to hurt, urges to take joy in the suffering of others with the teasing. And sometimes when I am brought into a family, because of the teasing, I will sometimes sit down with a child. I think I can do this effectively from 10, 11 years up and ask them, what's their motivation in teasing? Now, many children don't even know themselves. What the parents do is say, stop teasing, which is the least efficient way to teach any kind of moral compass, is to tell them to stop doing something. If you want a person to have the moral compass, they need to have the insight to know what is driving them. I want to give you a larger example of how I instruct parents. When a child is doing something the parent doesn't like, the instinct is to tell them not to, as opposed to sit down and explain to them, every human being has drives. Our drives are not moral. Our drives are not wise. Our drives are not rational. They just exist. And one way you gain self-knowledge is you ask yourself, what are my drives? Now remember, some people have a drive to be avoidant. Some people have a drive to be aggressive. Some people have a drive, a strange inner drive to feel inferior to others. Some people have a drive to feel superior to others. So I'm containing many things in this word drive. They might each not be apt, but one way you know yourself is to know your habits, your drives, your impulses, your automatic responses, and see them as clearly as you can. Because typically, our moral identity is not contained in our drives and habits. This is a piece of wisdom I've put together over the years, looking at myself, other people. And one of the greatest gifts you can give to a child or another person, with a child, you can probably teach this as a counselor. It's very difficult to be a counselor to an equal, to a spouse or somebody. But one of the greatest things you can give a child or a grandchild is understanding of their own drives. So one parent was telling me that a 6-year-old child just kept trying to come into the parents' bed when they got upset at night, waking the parents up who had another child to deal with, and they would get mad at the child. And so I offered, getting down eye level, very gently, and say, why do you come to our bed at 3 o'clock in the morning? Well, I'm upset and I'm scared. Okay. And what happens when you come to our bed? Well, I feel better. I'm going to introduce a word to you, the word drive. You wake up, you're scared, you're not thinking about it, and the first thing you want to do is come into our bed. Yes, so a drive is something that seeks satisfaction. You have a drive to something, you do it, and the drive is extinguished until the next time. By the way, this is also anger, defensiveness, and many of our bad habits is a drive within that arises because of some kind of trigger, some kind of catalyst. We are driven to act on it until the drive is extinguished. That is the human condition. That's why we do what we do many times, is because we're driven to it through unconscious forces. Then I asked the parent to understand, introduce the child to the second part of wisdom, insight to the self. What are my drives? What am I driven to do? What happens to other people when I act on my drive? Remember, drives are not wise. Drives are not empathetic. Drives are entirely about satisfying the inner drive. So I asked the parent just to ask the child, what happens to mommy and daddy when you get into our bed at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're scared? It wakes you up. Thank you. Next thing. Do you know what our lives are like? Do you know how mommy spends her day? How I spend my day. This is I recommend the father talk to the child. And the child was really at a loss. I mean, they know he knows what they do. He had never reflected on it. He had never thought about it. So the father asked the child to actually delineate what daddy's life is like, what mommy's life is like, especially since there's another little child in the home. So the 6-year-old little boy had to start thinking what the life of other people is like. And began to consider, I have a drive to feel safe. They have a need to rest. So it's my drive versus their need. Now, people with drives don't think that way. And I'm especially thinking of the drive toward anger, etc., where your drive actually runs up against another person's authentic need. And I think this is a very wise way to see the world. Your drives versus other people's needs. Your wants and desires versus other people's wants and desires. When you have a want, a desire, a need, your inner life goes through your justifications, why you need it, why it's good. We hardly ever stop and ask ourselves, what are the wants, needs, desires of the other person before I even say anything? This is called that aspect of wisdom, which is deep inferential knowledge into the inner life of another human being. Now, people who can do this, I think, truly become wise people, and we can teach it to children. So eventually, the dad was able to have the child understand that there's a consequence of his satisfying his drive to feel safe. Now the child had a moral dilemma. And you don't even have to teach the word moral dilemma to a child once they understand the effects of their drives, that their drives affect the well-being of other people. And I said, this is not to reprimand the child. The child's not in trouble. They're not a bad child. You're just teaching them, I think you can say, insight to a 6-year-old. You're just teaching them the consequences of what they do. And then I said to that dad, at that point, stop. Stop talking. Don't wrap it up. Don't give advice. The father said, well, isn't my point here to have my 6-year-old to stop coming into our room at night? And here's another piece of wisdom for parenting. No. Your ultimate goal is to teach your child the wisdom of insight into the self, including one's drives. insights into other people, their state of life, especially their inner consequences of your satisfying your drives. Because if you teach this when the kid is 6, 7, 8, 9, 19, 29, you've given the child a gift for life. So this is another part of my parenting, which I think you can all see attaches to every stage of our lives. Oftentimes, the unwise person is thinking short term, not the life of my relationship, not the life of what I'm doing with another person, but the short-term goal of getting a need met, as opposed to the long-term goal of creating a good relationship. Now, for me, I have to tell you, when I give people advice, when they ask my advice, this is one of the most powerful pieces of advice I can give myself and to give other people. Don't be persuaded by your unconscious ego self to go for short-term wins. It is one of the most unwise things we can do with our lives is to go for a short-term win. The wise person understands what's the long-term goal in any relationship, which I think is to create a nourishing interpersonal relationship. So, and how does this affect, by the way, our interpersonal relations with others? Many people, when they have a conflict, they believe their goal is to win the conflict to their own satisfaction. This is especially seductive when you are right. When you are right, when you know you're right, it's a very powerful impulse to get the other person to sign up for your being right. This is the source of much havoc in interpersonal lives. Because the short-term win of getting your way because you're right oftentimes is at the long-term loss of another person resenting you, of another person feeling overwhelmed by your rightness, another person feeling that you use your rightness as a weapon. So whenever you actually feel you're right, here is where you have to caution yourself and say to yourself, is that in the interest of the long-term relationship to push too hard on this one thing, or can I slow down on this and actually think about how to communicate it as opposed to win a given interaction or argument with other people? Now, where does this fit into with the theory? The insight into the processes and procedures of interpersonal lives. I think lives in any association, lives in the workplace, lives in religious organizations, lives in recreation. Everywhere I go, I have sometimes a thought on how things could be better. I learned a long time ago to not talk. When I think I have something worthy to say that affects other people, unless I'm asked, don't talk, don't make suggestions, until I understand what's going on. What are the deeper processes and procedures going on that I can't see? Usually when we have a good idea, we don't understand sometimes the deep cultural things going on where that idea has already been considered, but for one reason or another has been decided, either consciously or not, that it doesn't serve sometimes a family, an organization, a workplace. And so I learned, I especially learned this when I was in the military. When you arrive at a new base, first of all, you don't know yourself till you're there for a couple of months. You're in a new situation. Number two, other people don't know you because you haven't known yourself yet. And don't really talk for a couple of months. I remember when I arrived at my first long-term overseas duty in Okinawa. I remember I arrived, I'm a talkative person. I arrived and I said, don't talk, don't offer my opinion, don't solve anybody's problems, just observe what's going on here. I was in a barracks with 80 people, rather segregated, by the way. Most of the black guys chose to live at one end of the barracks, everybody else at another end of the barracks. And I'm thinking to myself, I didn't quite understand that. I thought segregation was over. Well, this was not imposed, this was voluntary. And I said, well, what's happening on this base? And I did a lot of observing about the different cliques. Once you get the uniform off and some guys put on their cowboy boots and some guys put on bandanas, I really wanted to watch. And I will congratulate myself that at 19 years old, I knew not to judge, not to think, not to talk until I really understand what's going on. And in order to understand what's going on, ask a lot of questions before I was even thought anything, which means not only not do anything, but check in with other people how they understood the situation. So I said in my Shabbat thought, one of the tests of a wise person is that they test their ideas, their assumptions, their theories, their understanding of the facts by reasoning with another person. A scientist can test out their ideas in the laboratory or in the field of nature. We human beings, in my mind, don't want to test our ideas out in putting them into action. We human beings ought to test our ideas out in reasoning with other people. Now that's from spouses, friends with each other, parents and children, children with parents, and every aspect of our life. A wise person knows how to be rational. A wise person knows how to reason. A wise person has insights into themselves, into other people, the process and procedures of life, understanding where they're headed. And I mostly think we should think long-term and not short-term, and the most efficient, reasonable, and non-harmful ways to get there. I'll repeat that again because that's my main message for this morning on this level of wisdom. A wise person starts with deep insight into yourself, your drives, your impulses, the nature of your intuitions, the way that you sense the world, the nature of your thoughts and feelings. We all have our own configuration. We're not alike. The way that I think is different from the way that you think. Would I characterize my thinking? Not as better or worse, but just how I think. I would want to know how another person thinks before I judge them. Not just what they think, but how they think. If I know how another person thinks, and I think there's a mistake, that's much greater knowledge than just knowing that they're making a mistake. You can't teach somebody unless you know how they think. I have to know how I think. My thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, my drives, my impulses, my intuitions, my sensations. It's all borrowed from Roberto Salgioli, obviously. And then apply that to other people. And then the other part is when you look at the different things we go through as human beings, and you can all name this. When you think of yourself as a child, all the way up to your current age, what are the processes you and other people went through, including developmental psychology, psychology of relationships, the ethics of relationships? Think of all the places that you have been that you've probably gone through pretty organically, but you never sat and thought to yourself, in a sense of reflective wisdom, what was the actual nature of that process that I went through to get from one thing in my life to the next? Most of us do this with intuitive, non-reflective knowledge. And that's, by the way, can be very good knowledge, unless your intuitive, non-reflective knowledge makes mistakes. I think a wiser person sits back and reflects. What's the process I'm going through with other people? What are their interests, their drives, their needs, their thoughts? What are mine? How do we communicate this? And come out of this minimally wiser people, in addition to however things are resolved. So next week I want to go on to other ideas of wisdom, both on Friday and Saturday. But here I want to combine the wisdom of Bezalel, which is to see the metaphysical plan, and I think we all should have great theories about the world, and then the wisdom of the weavers. It says the women of Chachmat Lev, described in the Torah portion of Vayakel. We see Bezalel, you might say, with his metaphysical wisdom, and the women who are sewing the fabrics, who are also called Chacham Lev, and see ourselves as both Bezalel and the seamstress, both the person with great overall wisdom and the person who can take that wisdom and actually sew two things together, and that Torah portion creates something of beauty. All right, that's my thought for today. I hope you found it interesting and meaningful.